Oops, let me go back one more slide. Okay, we're now going to look at section 2, which has to do with the impact of language. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the positive and the negative impacts of language in interpersonal relationships. Some of these that we get to will also be good for you to know about when you're writing for any of your classes. And I'll try to remember to let you know which are the ones to talk about. Okay, so the first one, come on. First one we want to talk about has to do with naming and identity. And there's a picture of Beyonce in Blue Ivy because, as the textbook says, there was a trademark dispute over her name. Okay, so think about how this is actually true, that names shape the way others think of us, names shape the way we view ourselves, and names shape the way we act. So I like that the textbook said that in, let me get the date, in 1900, the 20 most common names for baby girls included Bertha, Mildred, and Ethel. I'm going to guess that you do not know anybody with those names. Okay. However, the top 20 names in the early 2000s were Harper, Aria, and Avery. I know an Avery, my great niece, and Aria. Yeah, Harper. I don't know if I know anyone named Harper. But anyways, okay. So the textbook says that people with non-normative names, names that aren't mainstream, can suffer psychological and emotional disturbance. I think, just based on my own experiences, I think this was probably true more in the past than in the recent past, because what makes a name unusual changes over time. I think about that. If someone had a baby and decided to name the baby right now Mildred, that would be an unusual name. So, it changes over time. So you have to, for your own name or when you meet people, you think about, is this different name? It's unique. Is it distinctive, or is it somehow disturbing? They also talk about names that are spelled differently. I worked with someone for a while. Her name was Cindy, and she spelled it Cyndi instead of the much more common Cindy. So I'd like to talk about names and what we think of names when we're in the classroom. Okay, interesting, and think about this in terms of where you work. So it is true that we can build solidarity with others through speech, through the way we speak. So sometimes what happens is we want to sound like other people, and so we adapt our speech to match the speech of other people, and that is called convergence. If, on the other hand, you speak in a way that emphasizes that you're different, that's referred to as divergent. And the textbook says, people who are... Okay, two ways to look at this. People whose speech converges are much more likely to form a relationship, and people in relationships are much more likely to converge their speech. So, right now. Here's my husband talking in the hallway. Okay. Sometimes, so there are advantages to speaking the way other people speak. What is it? At Work on page 157 talks about swearing on the job and how sometimes if you are in a group where swearing is expected, if you don't swear, you would stand out. But then it goes on to say that, seriously think twice or 3 times before you decide to swear on the job, because when in doubt, don't do it. Okay, divergence. This is really common for teenagers, right? Teenagers don't want to sound like their parents. So that's where a lot of slang comes from. Okay, it's also fairly common. I in the past did a lot of work in manufacturing, and it was not uncommon for someone who worked on the shop floor to be promoted to a supervisory position. And that causes problems because one day this person was an employee with a bunch of employees, and the next day they're the boss, they're the supervisor of a bunch of people. And one way that they can show to other people that their status has changed is they're going to diverge their speaking. They won't speak the same way as people on the shop floor, and they will speak much more like other managers. Okay, so that is the idea of how we show that we are affiliated or connected with a group or not. Okay, power and politeness is interesting. We've got powerless language is when either the language itself or even your tone of voice is tentative. You would speak much more indirectly, and you would use hedges and hesitations. The textbook has a great example by using I guess, so maybe, and pauses, as opposed to powerful language, which is much more direct and forceful, and rather than using hedges and hesitation, uses declarations and assertions. So I don't want to say that one is good and one is bad, because sometimes powerless language is it's not so much powerless as it is being polite, and it's also very culturally determined. There are some cultures that are collectivistic, and also cultures that are high context, that really value politeness because it can save face for both the sender and the receiver. Instead of telling someone they did the job wrong, direct, forceful, I gave you very clear instructions and you did not do what I asked you. Well, that means the person who is being chastised is losing face. So a polite way could be something like, I'm thinking that maybe you did not understand the instructions that I gave you. Okay, so there's a very interesting, I should have put that in quotes, very interesting short video that Pantene put out called Sorry, Not Sorry, that you can watch, that looks at powerless language. And I wanted to say a word about a disclaimer. It's a kind of powerless speech where you might say something like, I don't mean to sound judgmental, but, and then what happens is you proceed to say something which comes across as judgmental. Disclaimers almost always backfire, in part because you've called attention to what you're going to do or how you're going to sound by saying you're not going to do that. I have a colleague who loves the phrase, with all due respect, and then what follows is not respectful. So, okay, be very careful about disclaimers. Alrighty. I don't know that I really even need to say anything about sexism and racism, because I suspect you are very much aware of it, but it is a section in the textbook, so let's go over it fairly quickly. So sexist language is language that unnecessarily differentiates between males and females and excludes, trivializes, or diminishes either sex. So how can you avoid sexist language? Well, you can eliminate sex-specific terms or use neutral terms. So years ago, people would talk about a chairman of a committee or a department. Well, then some of these chairmen were women. So then they would say chairwoman. So you could do that. You could say a chairman and a chairwoman. Or you could, what we do now is we just say chair. Someone is a chair. Okay. So I forgot what I was going to say. So that's how you could use a neutral term. Instead of mailman, You could say postal carrier. Or you could mark the sex clearly to heighten awareness of whether the reference is to a female or a male. That's not my favorite way to do that. Okay. Alrighty. There was a point I was going to make. Though the textbook says very interesting things that we don't think of as being sexist. But when you think about the difference between saying somebody, what does it mean to mother someone? Oh, so she we had a kitten who, the was abandoned, and so we, I don't know, what do you kittens? We put it with our dog that had just had a litter of puppies, and the dog mothered that kitten. Mothered means take care of and nurture. What does it mean to father someone, something? Okay, and that just, that only highlights the biological role. And then they talk about working mothers. Well, why don't we talk about working fathers? And they talk about a deadbeat dad. Why don't we talk about a deadbeat mom? So this is language that is sexist, and I don't think we are aware that it is sexist. And I'm not going to be language police, but I think it's good for all of us to, from time to time, take a step back and say, what am I actually saying here? Racist language is also demeaning because it classifies members of one group as superior and others as inferior. So how do we make sure that we are not using sexist language? We need to eliminate offensive labels and slurs. And rather that, the book talks about how people say, oh, it was just a slip of the tongue, or, oh, I was just making a joke with a friend. I didn't mean anything by it. And think about this in terms of what we talked about in chapter 5 with empathy. Put yourself in someone else's shoes. If you say this, how will a person who overhears you react to this? So that's what they say. It's a receiver orientation. How is the receiver going to hear what I'm saying? So, I like the book says, would you say a female doctor? Or you say, oh, well, it's a black professor. Well, would you say it's a white professor? On the other hand, many years ago, before my youngest sister got married, we were having a bridal shower, informal, at my parents' house. And I was talking to a family friend who we grew up together, but we don't see each other very often. And we were standing there talking, and she said, oh, where's Pam's fiance? And I pointed, there were two men talking by the fence, and I said, oh, he's over there. He's the guy in the cowboy hat. And so Louisa looked over and she said, Marguerite, it's okay to say he's black. So sometimes, we can use words like black and white, or we can use terms like Hispanic or Asian, and we're not using it in a racist way. It sometimes can be merely an adjective. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Now we're getting to the section of the text that is really going to apply for you, not just in your speech, but also in your writing. Okay, and it has to do with the overall idea of precision or vagueness. How precise are you? How detailed are you? Or are you at the level of vagueness? So ambiguous language is similar to equivocations from chapter 5, where someone gives you a painting and you don't like, and you say, oh my, this is so interesting. What exactly does interesting mean? Or, oh, it's unique. All right. So ambiguous language is language that has more than one commonly accepted definition. I like the ones in the police begin campaign to run down jaywalkers. So you're thinking, okay, the police are in their cruisers and they see someone who's jaywalking, which is crossing the street where they're not supposed to. without having pushed the walk button, and they run them over, or to run down, meaning they're trying to find them and charge them. Okay, so what happens in your mind? You know exactly what you're saying, and it just comes out a little bit wrong. Okay, this is my favorite. This has got to be my favorite part. The abstraction ladder. So up at the top of the ladder, language is fairly abstract. So your boss says to you, or a coworker says to you, you need to have a better attitude. And you think, what the heck does that mean? Well, let's get a little more specific. You need to be more positive. Okay, what exactly does that mean? Well, you need to complain less. Well, when do I complain? You need to complain less about working too hard. Well, I don't complain about working too hard. You need to quit complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends. That is very specific. And I want you especially to think about this, not just in your spoken language, but in your writing, because I notice a lot of students live at the top of this abstraction ladder because you know exactly what you mean. But what happens is it's a generalization, and since your professors are not mind readers, we don't know. So it's better to be as specific as possible. There's a wonderful chart on page 164 that gives some examples of how an abstract description and how it can become more specific by thinking about, by doing a behavioral description, who was involved, in what circumstance, and what were the specific behaviors. So to me, this also kind of connects back to the idea of perception checking, right? Describe the behavior. I think a lot of times we're not aware of our behavior, or we're not aware that aspects of our behavior are problematic. So bookmark this. Alrighty. Euphemisms are where it's what is it? The good, what we call it. Euphemism is it good omen? To use words of good omen. We do not like to use the word die. I don't know if this is common in other cultures. We could talk about that. But it is uncommon to hear people in the United States say so-and-so died. We don't, the word is too much. And so people will say somebody rather passed, or they passed away, or so my father, and I just want to say it. My father died about 2.5 years ago, and not, soon after he died, my sister would always say things like, we lost our father in April. And all I could think of was that time that I lost my daughter in Target, where she had hid actually it wasn't even Target, but in a department store. She hid, and then we couldn't find her. Or you lose your keys behind the couch cushions. Euphemisms make me nuts. I'm not someone who is very blunt, but euphemisms just bother me. I understand we use them to soften the impact of unpleasant information. In The Emperor's New Groove, which is one of my favorite movies there, when I just went blank on the emperor's name, Cusco decides he's going to fire his Yzma, who's the sorceress. Instead of saying you're fired, he says we're moving in a new direction, you're being let go, and he uses a whole bunch of euphemisms instead of saying you're fired. They for a while, when companies were getting rid of employees, they talked about downsizing. And then I heard the term, we're right-sizing. Well, if you no longer have a job, that does not feel like the right size for you. So I would say there is a way that you can be very kind in your language without sacrificing either your integrity or how clear you are in giving the message. You don't have to be blunt, but try to avoid euphemisms. Okay. Relative language is very interesting. Basically, relative language gains meaning by comparison. Remember I told you when I used to work in daycare center, and I work with 4-year-olds, and they would say to me, "Oh, Miss Marguerite, you're so tall." I am 5'2". That's not considered tall unless you're hanging around with 4-year-olds who are maybe 3'2". So for them, tall just meant taller than me. But what happens is we haven't linked the relative word tall to a more measurable term. Let's say it's the end of the semester, and things really, we had a great time together, and we decided that we want to go out. We're going to go out, and we're all going to have lunch together. And somebody says, we need to go someplace cheap. And somebody goes, great, let's just go across the street to Five Guys. And we're going, oh yeah, that's good. And somebody thinks, that isn't cheap. That's actually pretty expensive. Well, cheap compared to what? So if you can avoid relative language by turning words into numbers. I'd like to eat someplace where I can get a meal for $10 or less. I know when I go to the doctors, when I went for my back, and again when I've gone for my hand, they say, okay, so how today on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? Give me a number, or how much mobility, how much use do you have of it? So think about this also kind of in terms of the abstraction ladder. To say on a scale of 1 to 10, my pain is a 9 is much more concrete than saying I'm in a lot of pain. Okay, because like maybe for me a lot is 9, and maybe for my husband a lot is a 6. Okay. Evaluative language is sometimes called emotive language. This is tricky. It does describe something, but it also includes the speaker's attitude towards something. So you have a friend who does not like to spend a lot of money. Is very careful with their money. Everyone says, "Hey, let's go out to the movies, and then we're going to go out and we're going to have something to eat." And maybe your friend says, instead of all going out to eat, why don't we just why don't you guys come to my house and I don't know, we'll have sandwiches. This person says, "Well, I'm being thrifty," and maybe you think, no, they're being cheap. So if you call someone cheap, it means you disapprove of how tightly they hold on to a dollar. If you call them thrifty, you're approving of how tightly they hold on to a dollar. The same thing with the eccentric or crazy. Okay, or what do they have? Information or propaganda. So we use these terms, and frequently we are not even aware that we are using evaluative language. We're using emotive language. All right. One thing that the textbook doesn't talk about, but I think is important to think about, is the use of the verb to be. So if you were to say, I don't know, I got to think of someone who's not in the class. John is cheap. Okay. Once you've used the word is, you're saying that this is a central part of who this person is, of this person's character. Instead, you could say something like, how about describing it? John doesn't like to spend money on things until he's researched them well. Or at the college, we have classes that are developmental, which means they're not for college credit. It's for students who come to college. They're not yet at college level for math or English. And sometimes we refer to them, we say so-and-so, well, he is a developmental student, or she is a developmental student. And we've been working hard on getting people instead to say, she is taking a developmental English class. Because with that second one, she's taking a developmental English class, you're describing the situation. By saying she is a developmental student, it makes it seem like this is going to last forever. Same thing. I know I shared with the class that my son is on the autism spectrum. Notice how I said is on the spectrum. in the past, people would say so-and-so is autistic. Okay, and that's defining too much. So, if you think about this section in the chapter, can you think of how you use language to positively impact interpersonal relationships, and also how you or other people have used language to negatively impact interpersonal relationships? I would further ask, do you, when we went through these types of different kinds of languages, do you notice that there's one that you have more of a tendency to use, and now you're going to be more aware of it, and you're going to work to use language differently? I want you to be thinking about how you can use this knowledge to change your behavior to be a more competent communicator. Okay, we will go on to section 3 momentarily.